Welcome to Kids Academy.
Hi and welcome to the Kids Academy chess course. My name is Robert Lazorchak and I'm a certified teacher with international and national chess teaching certifications. I will be your guide as we begin to master this great game. Now let's get to the chess. Hi, my name is Rob Lazorchak and I'm very excited to be here with Kids Academy to create this tutorial series on how to play chess. So today we're going to talk about the rook. It's one of the fastest pieces, one of the most powerful pieces. And here it is. Here's a rook on d4. It looks kind of like a tower or a castle. In fact, a lot of people call it that, but the proper name is a rook. And rooks can go up and down and sideways to the left and sideways to the right. It kind of looks like a plus sign or the letter T. Now rooks have a lot of choices. They can do a short move and go one step, or they can go all the way to the top of the board in a single move. Same thing with sideways. They can move along the rank or the row one step or all the way across. So this rook has a lot of choices. I'm going to go ahead and pause the video and I want you to count how many squares this rook can move to, going up, down, or side to side. So let's count them together. This rook can go sideways 1, 2, 3, 4, up 5, 6, 7, 8, sideways to the left 9, 10, 11, and down 12, 13, 14. The rook has 14 choices. It can go sideways, up, down to any of those 14 squares. I'm going to go ahead and move the rook. The rook's on d4. I'm going to do a sideways move. And remember, in chess we call the rows ranks. So I'm going to move along the fourth rank, put the rook on h4. Now black would have a turn, and once it's my turn again, I'll move the rook on the file. That's our chess word for column or up and down. And I'm on the h file. I'll move the rook up to h8. The rook goes in straight lines, up, down, or side to side. Here's a square. Let's put a marker on c4. Now this rook, or any rook, can visit any square on the chessboard in only 2 turns. And I want you to think about, using our ranks and files, how this rook on h8 can get to the square c4 in only 2 turns. Go ahead and pause the video if you need to, but here's a hint. There are actually 2 paths to get to c4. Okay, so this rook can go across the rank and it would stop at c8, and on its second turn it can move down the c file and get to c4. We can go sideways and then down, or the second path, if you found it, we can go down first along the file, rook h4, and then we can use the fourth rank and play rook c4. 2 different ways of getting there. Both are totally fine and equally good. 2 ways to get to any square on the board, in this case to c4. Let's do another one. How can the rook get to How can the rook get to f6? So the rook can go sideways to f8 along the 8th rank and then to f6 on the f file, or the rook can go to h6, stop, and then go to f6 along the 6th rank. I'm going to go ahead and put this rook on c5. What if we want the rook to go to f2? Pause the video and think of 2 different ways the rook can get to f2 in only 2 turns. Using the 5th rank, we can go rook f5 and then down rook f2. Or we can go the opposite way. We can go down first rook c2 and then rook f2. A nice thing about the rook is that it captures in the same way it moves. So rooks can capture up, down, side to side, or we can say they capture on ranks and files. If I go ahead and put a black rook here on g5, and it's white's turn, this white rook is aiming at the black rook. It can see the black rook, and on white's turn, it could capture the rook. Now remember, when you capture a piece, your rook nudges into it, it replaces it, kind of nudges it out of the way ever so gently, and you take the captured piece, put it on the side of the board. So that black rook just got captured. Let's do another one. Let's see here. Put a black rook there. Now I'm going to put a pawn in the way. In this example, the white rook cannot capture the black rook. Do you know why? Well, we didn't talk about it yet, but this white rook is not able to jump over pieces. And as soon as you capture the first piece, your turn is over and you stop. So here the rook cannot capture the rook on g6 because the pawn is in the way. The rook could capture the black pawn if it wanted to, and then it stops. But now it's black's turn, and black has a very good move here. Black could capture the white rook. And we didn't talk about it yet, but because rooks are faster and they control more squares, rooks are more valuable than pawns. So in this position, the white rook would not want to capture the pawn on f6. Okay, time for a little quiz. Put a pawn here. Let's see, put a rook. Okay. In this example, which pawn can the rook capture? Can the rook capture the pawn on d4, or can the rook capture the pawn on f4? Now remember, rooks can move on ranks and files, so if I look up, there's nothing to capture. If I look sideways to the left, those squares are all empty, nothing to capture. If I look to the right, I can visit any of these squares, but they're all empty as well. However, if I look down along the D file, I see that the rook is aiming at the pawn on d4. The rook is able to capture. Okay, let's put a pawn here. Let's put a pawn here. Question number 2. Which pawn can the rook capture in this example? There's a pawn on h4, there's a pawn on f6, and there's a rook on d4. So this is a straight line, the rook to f6. But rooks don't travel diagonally. They travel on ranks and files. So while the rook could capture this pawn in 2 moves by going up on the file and over on the rank, we can't capture it in 1. The correct answer, if we look across along the rank, is the rook can capture the pawn on h4. Okay, final question. Let's see. In this game, which black rook can white capture? Which black rook can white capture? This one's a little bit trickier, but if you remember, we said rooks can't jump over pieces. Here, we cannot capture the rook on h7. We have a pawn on h6 that's in the way. This rook could only go 1 step, then he'd have to stop. We can't just barrel over or jump over, but if we look along the 4th rank and go sideways to the left, now the rook is able to capture the black rook on b4. We would slide into it, nudge it off, and pluck it off the board, put it on the side. So let's review what we learned about the rooks. Rooks can move up, down, or side to side. We learned 2 new chess vocabulary words today, ranks, which is a word for rows or side to side, and we learned the word file, which is for up and down, or we can say file instead of the word column. Rooks move on ranks and files as far as they want. They can do short moves, or if they have a clear path, an unobstructed path, they can move all the way across the board. A rook can visit any square on the board in 2 moves, and a rook can play on both colors. It can visit light squares, and it can visit dark squares. Rooks never jump over pieces, but if they have a clear line, they capture this same way that they move. So my name is Rob Lazorchak. That is it for the rooks today. Stay tuned for our next video on the bishops. Thank you so much.
Subscribe to our channel to stay updated on new videos.
Now that we've learned about the rook, it's time to learn about the second chess piece. Today we're going to learn about the bishop. Now if you remember, rooks move on ranks and files, or another way to put it is rooks can move up, down, and side to side as far as they like. Bishops can move diagonally. So if you take the plus sign that a rook can move like on ranks and files, and you tilt it so you have an X or multiplication symbol, that's how the bishop can move. The bishop can move diagonally, and if you play checkers, then you already know what diagonal means. Checkers pieces capture and move diagonally through the corners on the slant. So let's go ahead and look at our bishop. We have a bishop here on d5, and this bishop has a lot of choices. He can move like an X, as short or as far as he wants. So this bishop can go 1 step, 2 steps. He can go all the way across the board in any of these 4 directions to resemble an X. He can go one step to e4. He can go all the way on the long diagonal to the corner and reach h1. Now, because this bishop moves diagonally, you'll notice that if it starts on a light square, everywhere it goes, all of its choices end on a light square. If it starts on a light, it ends on a light. Even if we gave this bishop 10 moves, even 100 moves in a row, this bishop can never ever visit the dark squares. This bishop is always confined to half the board, to half the squares. But that's okay, because in chess, you start with two bishops. You start with a bishop on c1 on the dark squares if you're white, and a bishop on f1. So you'll always have a bishop that can theoretically visit any square on the board. Now let's practice moving this bishop. So let's use this bishop on f1. This bishop can go one step to e2, but I'm going to do kind of a far chess move. I'll put the bishop on b5, going on this diagonal. What if we wanted this bishop to go to g6? And I give you two moves. If I gave you two moves, can you figure out a path? Actually, there are two paths for this bishop to reach g6. Looking at your diagonals. Take a moment. If you need help, we can do this in reverse and take the square g6. And notice that in order to get to g6, we could first reach it by going to d3 or to e8. Can the bishop reach one of those squares? Of course, in fact, the bishop can reach both. So this bishop can go to e8 to get to g6 in 2 turns, or it can go diagonally down to d3 and then diagonally up. Either way, the bishop reaches g6. Just like the rook, the bishop captures the same way it moves. So if I were to put, let's see, a black pawn here, and it's white's turn, this bishop can capture the pawn. Bishops can go backwards, just like rooks. The bishop can go backwards and capture the pawn on d3. Let's see. Let's put a bishop here. We have a black bishop on the square f6. My first question is our bishop on d3 attacking? Is it aiming at the bishop on f6? The answer is no. If we look diagonally, we see that the bishop aims very close to it. The bishop passes through f5. The bishop passes through g6, but we are not aiming at f6. We also know this very quickly that the bishop is not attacking the other bishop because the bishop on f6 is on the opposite color. And this bishop on a light square can never, ever, ever attack a dark square. Now, a useful tip in the future, if your king is being harassed, if your pieces are being harassed by a bishop on a light square, you can guarantee their safety by putting them on a dark square, and that bishop would never be able to attack them. Okay, let's have another quiz. Let's see, I'll put a rook here. I will put a rook here. Which rook can the bishop capture? Go ahead and take a moment, look at your diagonals. Remember, starting on a light, ending on a light. Well, of course, we can't go up. This is how a rook would capture along the file, but we can go diagonally down and capture the rook on f1. Let's have a game that looks like this. Okay, which rook can the bishop capture here? Both rooks are on light squares. That makes it a little bit more difficult. But if we look at our diagonals, we can see if we go diagonally up to the right, diagonally down to the right, diagonally down to the left, and diagonally up to the left, there is only one rook that we're aiming at. Just because this rook is on a light square doesn't mean we can capture it. We're not aiming directly at it. Bishops move in straight lines along the diagonal. But this bishop is aiming at the rook on b5, and we can move it diagonally to capture. Last thing about the bishop, just like a rook, bishops cannot jump over pieces. So if we put a black rook here, and we put, let's see, we'll put a white rook here. Our bishop on b5 cannot capture that black rook. We're aiming at it, that's true. It's on the same diagonal, starting on a light, ending on a light. But there is a problem. Our white rook is in the way, and we can't jump over. The bishop can go as far as it wants until it either runs into its own piece, at which point it would have to stop, or once it captures a piece, the bishop also stops. Remember, you can never capture more than one piece per turn. So if you capture a piece, that bishop stops and replaces it. If you run into your own piece, the bishop would stop the square before it. So let's review what we learned about the bishop today. Bishops can move like an X along the diagonal. That's now our third chess vocabulary word, rank, file, diagonal in terms of movement. They can move short or they can move as far as they want as long as they have a clear path. Once they capture a piece, they must stop and they cannot jump over pieces. So if a piece is blocking them, they would have to stop the square before. You have two bishops to start a game. You have a bishop on c1, c8 if you're black, f1 for white, and f8 if you're black, a light square bishop and a dark square bishop. They are one of the fastest pieces in chess, along with the rook and the queen, and a very strong piece. The next time we meet, we will be talking about the knight, a lot of chess kids' favorite piece, a lot of young chess players' favorite piece. Okay, Kids Academy, today I'm very excited because today we are going to learn about the strongest piece in chess, the best soldier, and that is it's the queen, of course. The queen is so strong because she can move like a rook and a bishop. She can move on ranks, files, and diagonals. Now you're probably asking yourself, what determines how strong a piece is? A lot of young chess players tell me that it depends on how tall they are. We know pawns are the weakest because they're the shortest piece, and they think that the king is the strongest because he's the tallest, and they think the queen is pretty strong because she's almost as tall as the king. But that's not quite right. What really determines a piece's strength is how many squares it can control, how many squares it can attack. And because the queen can move like a rook, and she can move like a bishop, she can attack the most number of squares on the board, and she is the strongest piece. If you don't believe me, let's take a look for ourselves. Let's count together how many squares this queen can move like. So first I'll highlight the rook movements. Here's the rank. The queen's on the 5th rank. I'll highlight the file. The queen is on the D file. Now I'll make my diagonal lines like a bishop. Diagonally down to the right, diagonally down to the left, and now I'll count the squares, and you can count them with me, and we will see just how strong the queen is. So I'll start at the bottom. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Along the rank, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, the diagonals. 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, and our last diagonal, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27. Wow, this queen is attacking 27 squares. My goodness, she is very strong and she's very fast. So because this queen can move like a rook, and because the queen can move like a bishop, she's able to move very quickly in all of these directions. Let's practice moving the queen. I'll move the queen over to h5. I'll highlight the movement. Is this a rook move or a bishop move? If you said that queen just moved like a rook, you'd be absolutely right. The queen moved along the rank. Going side to side is how a rook would move. If the queen's on h5 and she decides to go to d1, back to her starting square, would that be a rook move or a bishop move? Starting on a light, ending on a light, going through the corners on the slant, that's a diagonal, and that is bingo, exactly how the bishop moves. Okay, which piece can the queen capture in this game? There are two black rooks, one on b5 and one on g4. Which rook is the queen aiming at? If you said g4, you're absolutely correct. The queen can move like a bishop and capture this rook on g4 on the diagonal. Very good. And let's put a rook here. We will put a bishop here. And it's white to play. Which piece can the queen capture? Once again, the queen can capture the rook, this time using her rook movement, sliding along the 4th rank. The queen can capture the rook on b4. What if we wanted this queen to go to f7? How could the queen get to f7 in 2 moves? Think of as many paths as you can. Now, because she can move like a rook and a bishop, she actually has way more than 2 different paths. And let's count them together. Okay, so we can move like the rook, the way we did the rook lesson. We can go up and over. We can go over and up. We can move like a bishop and go down and diagonally. That's the third way. Or over one and diagonally, that's a fourth way. We can move on the dark square diagonal like a bishop. This is way number 5. We can go all the way up to the corner, up to the top, to the 8th rank, and then go down 6 different ways. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye. In today's lesson, we're going to learn about the knight. In some languages, they call the knight the jumper or the leaper because the knight can do exactly that. It has a special power that nobody else can do. Not the queen, not the rook, not the bishop. The knight's special power is that it can jump over pieces. But before we get to the jumping, let's first learn how the knight can move. Now I'm going to show you 2 different ways that the knight can move, or I'll teach you 2 different ways. The first is called the L method, and this is the way that most chess teachers teach the knight. The knight can go step, step, turn, and the movement resembles an uppercase L. Step, step, turn, a capital L. The knight can go down 2 and then step to the side 1. The knight could also make a sideways L, step, step, turn, an upside down L, step, step, turn. If you think of it, this L looks like it's standing on its head. It's an upside down L. This knight, another way to think of it, is that because knights can jump, and because they're animals that live on a farm, we can pretend that this knight is surrounded, enclosed by a fence. And another way to think about the knight moving is that this knight can jump over the fence and go to the square on the opposite color. So if this knight is on a dark square, it is allowed to jump over the fence and go to the nearest light square. Jump over the fence, go to the light square. You'll also see this is an L shape, step, step, turn, or step, step, turn. But another way to think about it is the knight jumps over the fence and goes to a square of the opposite color. So whichever method you prefer to count out your knight moves, step, step, turn, or you can imagine there's a fence that the knight jumps over. The knight always, whichever method you use, the knight always goes to a square of the opposite color. So if the knight is on a dark square, all of its choices will be light. If the knight is on a light square, all of its movements will end up on a dark square. Now let's do some of these knight movements and let's see how many we can find. We already named a couple. We said step, step, turn. So here's one. I see an L, step, step, turn. Here's a second one. Step, step, turn. Here's a third one. Notice they're all squares on the opposite color. This knight is on E5. That's a dark square. All the squares we're finding for the knight to move to are light. Step, step, turn. D3. Step, step, turn. I'm starting to see a pattern here. F3. The knight can go to G4. Step, step, turn. That's a sideways L. If it helps, I'll even draw the fence around the knight. And we listed all of these squares so far. The last 2, F7, G6. This knight, if it's in the middle of the board, can attack 8 squares. It's a pretty strong piece. It can attack 8 squares. Some chess teachers call this knight an octopus knight because an octopus has 8 tentacles going in all these different directions, just like this knight. This knight is attacking 8 squares in many different directions. What if we put this knight on the side of the board? If this knight ended up on H5, does it still attack 8 squares? No, it doesn't. Let's count them together. So I see the knight is on a light square. So every square it goes to must be dark. I'm going to draw the fence. And I'm going to count out my L, step, step, turn. We can go here to G7, to F6, to F4, and to G3. This knight on the side of the board can only go to 4, only half as many. So knights don't really like being on the edge of the board. In fact, there's a saying in chess, a knight on the rim is dim. A knight on the edge of the board can't do nearly as much as a knight in the center. It only can influence half the number of squares. But do you know where knights really get sad? They do not like being in the corners because a knight in the corner can only attack 2 squares. That's not very helpful at all. So let's go back. Here's our knight in the middle of the board. He can attack 8 squares moving in an L shape. Now let's go back to its special power, its special ability. This knight is able to jump. The knight is the only piece that, one, it's able to jump over other pieces, and it can jump over its own color pieces as well as enemy pieces. And this knight is the only piece that can change direction in the middle of a turn. Step, step, turn to the side. Everything else moves in straight lines. So here's a knight. I will put a rook here, and I'll put a black rook here. Now this knight can absolutely capture this black rook. Even though this rook is kind of in the way, thinking about step, step, turn, the knight can just hop over and capture the rook. Even if there's a black piece in the way, we can put a bishop here, and we can put a rook over here. This knight can once again jump over, step, step, turn. Now, you don't capture the enemy piece by jumping over. If I were to jump over you, you'd be safe, you'd be fine. But if I were to land on top of you, well, then you'd be hurt, then you'd be captured in chess. Same thing in chess. If you jump over a piece, that piece remains on the board. But if you land on a piece, that is how knights capture. And going back to the rule we spoke about earlier, you can never capture more than one piece per turn. So you definitely don't capture the piece you jump over. Knights capture the piece they land on. Okay, let's put a bishop here, and let's put a bishop here. In this game, which bishop can the knight capture? If it helps, you can think about the box and the knight jumping over to the opposite color square, or you can start looking at your L's, thinking about step, step, turn. Which bishop is the knight aiming at? If you said f8, you're absolutely correct. This knight can move to f8, step, step, turn, and capture that bishop. Very good. Let's put a knight here, and we'll put a rook over here, and we'll put a rook right here. Okay, in this game, which rook can the knight capture? Well, if you said the rook on f5, your L is a little bit too big. This would be step, 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 turn, and that would be 4 squares. Knight can't move that far. They go step, step, turn, 2 and then 1 to the side. So this knight is able to capture the rook on d4. Let's see. What if I want to capture this rook on f7 in 2 turns? What would be a good first move so that on the second turn I'm able to go to f7 and capture the rook? So we know knights can move in an L shape, so I'm going to highlight all these squares. Whoops, there are 8 of them. Step, step, turn. Now let's see, if we go here, does that aim at the rook? No, that's too far. That's not an L away. If we go here, will that aim at the rook? Nope. That's how a rook would capture, going on the rank 1 square. But that's not how knights move. What if we try this square d8? Step, step, turn. If we go to d8, are we now a knight's move away from the rook on f7? Well, let's see. Step, step, turn. It looks like we can capture that rook on our very next move. Same thing with this square e5. If we go to e5 using our step, step, turn idea, on our second move, we can do another L shape standing on its head and go right to f7 to capture the rook. So let's review what we learned about the knight. The knight moves in an L shape, or if you like to think of it as a horse leaping over a fence, it leaps over the fence and goes to a square of the opposite color. The knight has a special power that no one else can do. It can jump over its own pieces and enemy pieces, but remember, the knight can only capture if it lands on top. The knight always changes squares, square colors. So if a knight is on a light square, every move it makes will be dark. And once it reaches that dark square on its next turn, every square will be light. It always changes colors. Hi Kids Academy. Today we're going to be learning about the pawn. Now it's true the pawn is the weakest piece in chess, but a famous chess player named Philidor once said that pawns are the soul of chess, so it's very important that we learn as much about them as we can. Now to start with, you have 8 of them, and you can think of pawns as foot soldiers, or in some languages they call the pawn a farmer because he works so hard. He does so much work for the team. Now white has 8 pawns going all across the second rank. You can count them. Here are 8 of them. Black has 8 pawns, and they start on the 7th rank. Now the black team always starts on rank 7 and 8. White starts on 1 and 2. And now we're going to learn about the pawn and how it moves. When a pawn is on its starting rank, it has a choice. It can go 1 step, or the pawn can get a running start and go 2 steps forward. The pawn can only go 2 steps if it's still on its starting square. So I'll move my pawn to a4. I will play pawn to e5 for black. This pawn was on its starting square, so he had a choice. He could go to e6 or e5. And now it's white's turn again. This pawn no longer has a choice. He cannot go 2 steps anymore. I know that because he is not on its starting square. This pawn started on a2, and now he's on a4, so he no longer has a choice. Once a pawn has left its starting square, pawns march forward 1 square at a time. So if I wanted to move this pawn, I could put him forward to a5. This pawn can no longer go 2 steps. This pawn can no longer go 2 steps. This pawn can go forward 1 to e4. Now, pawns capture diagonally. So they capture differently than they move. Pawns move forward. They never go sideways. They never go backwards. It's the only piece in chess. So after white plays pawn to a5 and black plays pawn to e4, if white plays the move pawn to e3, now this black pawn actually is out of moves. He can no longer go forward because there's someone in the way, and pawns do not attack forward. Pawns attack diagonally. So this pawn, we say it's stuck. It's frozen. It has no moves to make. There's someone blocking his path forward, and pawns attack diagonally, and I'll show you what that means right now. If black plays the move pawn b6, this pawn can capture the black pawn. This pawn can capture on b6 because pawns capture diagonally forward 1 step. Now it's black's turn. Can black recapture on b6? The answer is yes. Both the pawn on c7 or the pawn on a7 can capture that pawn. The black pawns are starting on the 7th rank. They're marching down the board, so this would be a forward capture for the c7 and a7 pawn. The pawn can capture. Okay, white plays the move pawn b4. Black plays the move pawn b5. Can this white pawn capture the black pawn on b5? The answer is no. The white pawn does not capture. Pawns do not capture moving forward, so this black pawn is safe. Can this white pawn move at all? The answer is no. Pawns never go sideways. Pawns never go backwards. They do not capture moving forwards. There's nothing for the pawn to capture diagonally, so this pawn is stuck. He has no moves to make. White would have to think of something else to move. Pawn a3. Okay, time for some questions. Can this pawn on a7 go to a5? The answer is yes. The pawn can go 2 steps and go to a5. Remember, a pawn on its starting square and the black pawns start on the 7th rank. A pawn on its starting square has an option, 1 step or 2. After that, pawns go 1 at a time. Okay, let's pretend we have a position where this black pawn is on h4. Now, one thing I did not mention yet is that if you have a pawn on its starting square, it cannot go forward 1 and do a capture. I know I said a pawn on its starting square can go 2 spaces on its first move, but the pawn can only go 2 spaces in the forward direction. We cannot combine a forward square and a capture. So this pawn can go forward 2, or he could have gone forward 1, but this pawn is not allowed to go forward 1 and then do a capture in the same turn. Let's put the black pawn back. Okay, so let's play pawn g4 for white. Let's play pawn f5 for black. White's turn. Does white have any captures in this position? And once you answer that question, are there any white pawns that can no longer move right now that are stuck? So to answer those questions, we have a capture here. Our pawn on g4 is attacking the black pawn on f5. White could capture. Conversely, the black pawn is attacking the white pawn. So if it were black's turn, the black pawn could do a capture. And the question about pawns being stuck. Let's see. Well, this pawn on h3 has nothing to capture, and he can't go forward. There's a black pawn standing in his way. And also, even if it weren't a black pawn, if it were a bishop, this pawn would still be stuck. As long as there's something in the way that prevents the pawn from moving forward, because there could only be one piece or pawn on a square at a time, then this pawn has no moves to make. Can't go forward, can't do a capture. Also, the pawn on b4 and black's pawn on b5 are both also stuck. They have no moves to make right now. The last thing I want to tell you about pawns before we stop this video, it's very rarely a good idea to send one pawn off by itself, because when it gets close to the other end of the board, it'll either get stuck or captured. Pawns love to work together as a team to make what's called a pawn chain. Notice how this white pawn on f2 protects the pawn on g3, which in turn protects the pawn on h4. So that means if any black pieces were to capture this pawn on h4, white would be able to capture back. g3 is guarding h4, so at the very least it would be a fair trade. Maybe white could even win some material. So use your pawns together as a team as they slowly march across the board and take up more and more space. Let's review what we learned about pawns. Pawns never go sideways, they never go backwards. When a pawn is on its starting square, on the second rank for white or the seventh rank for black, when a pawn is on its starting square, it has a choice. It can go forward one step or two. But once the pawn has left its starting square, pawns move forward one step at a time. Pawns capture in a different way than they move. So pawns move forward, but they capture diagonally one step at a time. They never capture diagonally two steps, even if they're on their starting square. Pawns can capture diagonally one step at a time. If there's a pawn in front of our pawn, or if there's a piece in front of our pawn, and we have no captures to make, then we say that pawn is stuck. It cannot move. It has no options. We would have to think of something else and move that piece instead. So that is it for the pawns, probably the trickiest piece. And I want you to really get some practice playing pawns. My recommendation would be to play a pawn war, 8 pawns against 8 pawns. And you can play with someone at home or a friend. And the winner of this pawn war would be the first player to get a pawn to the other side of the board. So remember, use your pawns as a team, create pawn chains, march them across the board together so they can support one another, and try to get a pawn to the other end. That'll help us practice pawn movements, pawn captures. Pawns have a lot of special rules that don't apply to other pieces, and it'll give us a lot of practice with this very important, albeit weaker, piece. Hi, it's Coach Rob from Kids Academy, and today we're going to learn about the most important piece in chess, and that is the king. Now, the king is the leader of the army. I like to think of him as the commander of the army. And really, it's our job in chess to keep our king safe and attack our opponent's king. That's how you win a game, and it's also how you lose the game. You can tell which piece is the king because he is always the tallest piece on the chessboard, and he has a little cross over his head, or it looks like a plus sign. Here is the white king on the chessboard, and now let's learn how the king can move. For the king, I like to think of him as an old man. He hobbles around his kingdom very slowly. He can go one step at a time. So this king that's on e4 can move on ranks, files, or diagonally, so long as it's one step. So this king on e4 has 8 different choices. He can go diagonally, he can go sideways, diagonally down, even backwards. So this king has 8 different moves. Let's go ahead and practice moving the king. I know kings can go one step, and now so do you, so I will move the king to d5. If the king is on d5, where could the king go again? Well, he has a lot of choices, but if you chose d6, absolutely correct. Also, he could have gone to any of these squares one step away. Now, kings can capture the same way they move. So while they move one step at a time, they also capture one step at a time in any direction. If we put a black rook here on e6, the white king can capture. by moving diagonally one square. If we have a game that looks like this, we'll put a rook on d8 and a rook on f7. Which rook can the king capture if it were white to move? Well, we know kings can go one step and they capture in one step, so this king can capture the rook on f7. The rook on d8 is too far away. That would take 2 turns for the king to get there. So king takes f7 is a very nice move. Let's get rid of the rook for a moment. What if we wanted this king to end up on g5 and I gave you 2 turns to do it? What would be a good first move so that on the second move the king can reach g5? And here's g5. I'll put a little marker on it. Well, we know kings can go one step at a time, so in order to get to g5, we first have to get to a square that's adjacent to it, that touches it. So the king actually has 2 choices on the first move. He can either play king f6 or king g6, and then on his second move, both squares will allow him to reach g5. The other thing I want to tell you about the king, and we'll touch more on this later when we have a video about check and checkmate, but for right now what I want to tell you is that kings can never ever be put in danger. He is the leader of your army. He's the most important piece. It is your job to keep your king safe. So you can never put your king onto a square that an enemy piece is aiming at. So for example, if we put a rook here on d8, this king would not be allowed to go to d6 or d5 or d4, because we know rooks can move on ranks and files, and this rook is aiming all the way down the d file, controlling those squares. If you were to play a game and your opponent did try to play the move king d5, what you should do is politely tell your partner that that's an illegal move. You cannot put your king in danger, to take it back and try again. So let's summarize the king. Kings are old men and they go one step at a time in any direction. They can move on ranks, they can move on files, and they can move diagonally. Kings capture the same way they move, so they can capture one step away. And remember, the king is the most important piece in your army, the most important piece in the kingdom, and you have to keep your king safe. You are never allowed to put your king in danger, or another way of saying that is you are never allowed to put your king in check. As a general rule of thumb, I try to put my king behind my pieces so they can act as protectors to keep the leader safe. That's it for now. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Subscribe to our channel to stay updated on new videos. Find links to our apps in the comments below.